to Midwood High School was not very easy. While I was at Midwood, my main focus was to work hard, get good grades, and get a scholarship so I could go away to college. I was very lucky that General Motors gave me a full scholarship for college. Thank you, General Motors. I started out at Radcliffe and spent a lot of time on the top of the Fogg Art Museum looking out the window and drawing. Some of you may have heard of Agnes Mungan, who was a legend in the art world. She saw my drawings and said, Sue, what are you studying? And I said, well, I'm actually a biochemistry major, but I want to be an artist. And through her good offices, I was able to get a scholarship to the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in Maine. This was a school that specialized in inviting artists who were trying and succeeding in getting out of Europe. George Gross was one of them. He was a wonderful teacher, very strict. He always talked about the line, and he had a great sense of humor. He made these kind of angled cardboards that he called the Picasso Finder. And when the visiting trustees came to Skowhegan, he handed each one of them a Picasso Finder to go out in the woods and look for Picassos. They took it very seriously. He just meant it as a joke. At Brandeis, I studied with Arthur Polonsky, who was one of the great draftsmen in the New England area. Some of you may know his work. My advisor at Brandeis, knowing my interest in science, also suggested I take a course with Henry Lynchitz. Little did I know that 6 years later we would get married. This is a photo that Henry took of me the year we married. He was very skilled at many things, including photography. You'll find in my talk that I will segue a lot between images of people, of landscapes, of historical events, and of city images. After college, I tried to find a job teaching art in New York City. You couldn't do that unless you were already famous. So instead, I had a job teaching physical science at the Fashion Institute of Technology, based entirely on my notebooks from college. After that, I couldn't find any teaching jobs except in the Midwest, where I didn't want to go. So what did I do? I applied for a grant. The Fulbright Commission suggested I might want to go to Poland, but when I told them my favorite place to work was on top of tall buildings, they said, forget Poland, they'll think you're a spy. How about Paris? Who could say no to spending a year in Paris? This is a painting looking out of my window at the Cité Universitaire at Parc Montsouris. It has a kind of a surreal quality to it, and it was a painting that I did when I was terribly sad, because while I was on the Fulbright, my father collapsed with a heart attack. I have inherited his genes. But I find the color really helped lift my spirits. The next group of images I call the American Ritual series. They're about the turmoil of the 60s, and specifically the Martin Luther King assassination and the Robert Kennedy assassination. You can see it's almost a mural-like composition with images of clergy. There are no portraits, but there are suggestions of what was going on in that period. On the right, there's an image of a train, which in my mind got me thinking of the train that brought Lincoln through the country after he was assassinated. It also conflated with my experience of the New York subways. This series has 10 paintings in it. Some are local, but the main thing about the series is it started realistic and it became more abstract as I went along. But I kept the same structure of the beer and some of the figures in the painting. The third one is even more abstract. A late friend of mine used to say when she passed away, she wanted to have something like a New Orleans funeral. And I was thinking about that when I did this painting. This and a series from the group are on permanent exhibition at Emmanuel College. In 1965, our son was born. So I had to stop driving too fast, and my husband and I were, of course, thrilled to watch him learn about everything, and everything was new and exciting. Now I'm going to segue to our first family stay in Israel, which is in about 1971. This is an etching of a woman praying. Outside you see what used to be called the Wailing Wall. It's now called the Western Wall. There is still an ongoing dispute in Israel about whether men and women should be allowed to pray together. Some things don't seem to change. This painting is in an Israeli collection. It's called Desert Threat. What it's about is in 1971, a group of deranged Japanese terrorists came through Lud Airport and started shooting at everyone. No rhyme or reason. Everyone in Israel was shocked. In the whole world, people were shocked. I see it almost like the canary in the coal mine. First, terrorism was in Israel, and sadly today, we understand that it is everywhere. I wanted the fragile, that piece of burlap to suggest the fragility of humanity and the dark colors, the threats of terrorism. This is a pretty autobiographical drawing, one of many that I did about my heart surgery. Every November, the first weekend, we have open studios in Waltham, where my studio is. And that year, I exhibited only paintings about surgery. My husband thought I was nuts, but people found it quite interesting because a lot of people have had surgery. And I think I was influenced in a way by my memories of some of Rembrandt's work. I'm segueing now to the formation of Artists for Survival. Many of you probably remember Reagan and Caspar Weinberger, his defense secretary, who spoke blithely about winning a small nuclear war. Well, they managed to scare everybody. And my colleague Mitch Kamen and myself were doing paintings about our fears of nuclear war, and we had a show at the Countway Library. A few days later, the Globe called up and said, tell me about your group. Well, at that point, our group consisted of 2 people. So I said, well, we're Artists for Survival. Within a couple of weeks, dozens of artists joined us because there was a feeling among all groups, not just artists, but musicians, writers, psychologists, business people, that something had to be done to reduce the number of nuclear weapons. Some of you may remember in 1982, there was a peace rally in New York City where 1 million people marched through the streets supporting the nuclear weapons freeze that Randall Forsberg had written. And I tried to convey this sense of energy with people holding posters, the Bread and Puppet Theater also was there, and there were no cars. At that time, my mother and various relatives joined us. It was a real group plea to do something about the insane number of nuclear weapons that the world had and still has. This is in the Portland Museum of Art. Back to Boston. I'm very interested in reflections and the sense of being inside and outside a place at the same time. And the John Hancock building is one of the most appealing to me. I don't know if any of you recognize this, but it's actually an image of North Station. I sometimes feel as soon as I paint or draw something, it either disappears or changes. And in a way, the art becomes something of a historical marker. This is my drawing of Oskar Kokoschka. It's based on a photograph that I took when I studied with Kokoschka. I'll read a little bit from my book about the experience of studying with him in 1987. His school was the School of Vision. Here, Kokoschka wanted to teach his students to see. We had models from 10 in the morning till 6 at night, 6 days a week, and they held their poses for 20 minutes. The models were clothed because the idea of the class was to learn about movement and position, color and space, without getting bogged down in anatomy. Working in watercolor, well, it was pretty hard to do much in 20 minutes, but it helped us try to grasp something about space and mood and movement in that short period of time. Whenever I've taught watercolor or acrylic or collage, I think of his teachings in terms of trying to get students to see and feel and be free and expressive. I wanted to show him as a really wonderful European gentleman. His English wife, Olda, used to come around with him to class to be sure he didn't start drinking wine before 12 o'clock. But he was extremely encouraging. He often talked about the fact he did not understand abstract art. He said art has to be about something. Going on to a totally different experience was a trip with a group called Interhelp to the Soviet Union. Interhelp was a support group for social activists, mostly burnt out social activists. Henry and I were going to Monhegan Island and had some kind of a tiff. And there was a lovely woman with 2 daughters sitting opposite, so I went over to talk to her. And soon she was asking what brought us on the trip. And we explained that we needed some kind of relaxation, and we're looking forward to walking on the dunes and taking photos and making sketches. She was excited to learn we were active in the anti-nuclear movement. And we talked about our families. I told her about our studio group, and she said the next summer they were planning their first trip to the Soviet Union. Would I be interested? And I said, sure, yes, very interested. It was an amazing 3-week trip that included Moscow, Leningrad, and Tbilisi, which is in the south, in the Caucasus, where all the statues are to poets and peacemakers. There were no statues of generals. Unfortunately, everything has changed for the worst in the Soviet Union. But this trip was very inspiring. We invited a man from the Soviet Union named Misha to visit, and the people in the Interhelp trip subsidized his coming to the United States. And when he came to visit our studios, there was an Army recruiting office right across the street. And he said, can I go in there? And we said, sure. And he went in and started picking up pamphlets and information. And it was mind-boggling to him that in the United States, you could go into an Army recruiting office and get anything without being arrested or getting into trouble. This image was one of many I did after coming home of my impressions in the Soviet Union. It happens to be a little town called Zagorsk with wonderful mosques, and you can see that I've used my imagination with having some angels with halos floating around, and I did about a dozen of these, and it surprised me because I didn't know what the visual legacy would be of the trip, but the trip was extremely inspiring. We often met Soviet citizens who had to travel great distances to meet us at some risk. Even though it was an era with Gorbachev and Samizdat, there still was kind of a lack of trust. And we had a group that would talk about all of our experiences at the end of the day. I write about that quite a bit in my book. This next image comes from a trip that Henry and I took to Tuscany. Well, Tuscany is a dream place for anybody, particularly an artist, because you see the backgrounds of all the great Renaissance paintings right in front of you. This painting I did from sketches that I made in Tuscany. The reason we got to go to this particular place called Spinocchia is that at one of the open studios, a woman who raised funds for the BSO came and she said, this is in November, she said, I'm about to go to Tuscany. And I said, oh, how nice, can I go with you? And she said, no, but I can tell you how to get in touch with the niece of Count Ferdinand Cinelli, who owns a castle in Tuscany called Spinocchia. And he loves to have artists stay at his farmhouses. So this painting and several others were inspired by being at Spinocchia. I have a few notes of things that I want to remember to read. Here we're back in Boston. And as you can see, again, I'm interested in inside and outside and reflections and color balance. It actually was inspired by a little cafe on Huntington Avenue. It might have even been a Burger King, but it was these hanging flowers that got me interested in this. You have to excuse my voice. It's a little bit hoarse because I'm getting over pneumonia. This is a whole major series of my work. My mother is sitting on the porch of the house I still live in near Brandeis in Waltham, looking very strong. This one is at the Fog. And I continue to draw and paint my mother for the last 18 years of her life. She was very patient about this, and often she would say, well, I'll pose, but I need to have a book to read. This drawing, called My Mother Three Times, is one of my favorite. I feel it is related to images, triptych images of saints. And I said to myself, well, why not use the same image to depict my mother? Three places in her small New York kitchen, probably making oatmeal, working at the sink. I like this one very much. It's been in shows at the Danforth. I don't know where it will be shown next, because they're having some issues with money at the Danforth. Scientists are very lucky. They get to travel all over and their wives can come with them. And this is about the city of Prague, which is one of the most beautiful cities in the world, with one of the worst histories. In this, I wanted to show the structure of the city. The technique is a combination of dry point, which is done with a tool with a diamond point that makes a particular kind of line, and monotype, where I use a roller with different colors. I did about 10 of this particular series. This, which I feel is one of my strongest paintings at the moment, it's in a friend's collection in Brighton. It's called Prague and the Jewish Cemetery. Some of you may know of the Jewish cemetery in Prague. It's a tiny place with all the stones piled every which way on top of each other. And I've liberated them and put them out on the hillside where you could then see the city beyond. Friends have said they see suggestions of candles in the church, in the cathedral. There's a contrast. You probably know of Theresienstadt and some of the really bad history that went on in Prague. A totally different series is inspired by Times Square. I really love Times Square because it's so crazy and so many colors and so much energy. I was there at the end of August, and it was a little too crazy. There were too many people. I had never expected to see nude women playing the guitar, but for the most part, there still are places where there are no cars, so it's easy to walk around and do sketches and take photos without risking being run over if you run out into the street. This is a combination of oil and collage. There are a few sections in the middle, and this green piece, a few sections that are actually collaged onto the canvas. Again, this is one of many series about Times Square. There are others in the book. The Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, that used to have a wonderful gallery, asked me to do a series inspired by my favorite places in Boston, and this was a study for this series. You can see Copley Square, some images from Post Office Square. I like combining different kinds of imagery in one painting. When I'm feeling a little lost or uncertain about how things are going, I often do a self-portrait. In this one, you can tell that I'm not in a very confident mood. This is also in the Portland Museum. Friends said, well, how come I'm not smiling? Well, it's pretty hard to stare at yourself and draw and smile at the same time. It's not as if you're talking to someone. I'll read a little bit from the book from September 11, 2001, the attack on the World Trade Center. This is one of 4 images that are in the book. The World Trade Center and the Pentagon have been attacked. Is this another Pearl Harbor? A disaster? As a nation, we see that we are all vulnerable. It's hard to concentrate due to feelings of devastation, sorrow, exhaustion. I'm relieved that my mom is no longer around to witness this terrible day as a native New Yorker. I make many black marks in sketchbooks, some taking the shape of the fallen towers, which you can see in the bottom of this mixed media work. It's impossible for me to use color for many weeks, so I just draw strokes in charcoal, black and white. I don't know, in the lower right hand, there's a little bit of normalcy, just a small amount, a little cafe and a chair and table. And there's an image that may be a Christ-like image. There are collage pieces, all those black and white sections that I put onto onto the painting. This is an homage to one of my favorite artists, Giovanni Bellini, and it's inspired by a painting in the Frick called St. Francis in the Desert. When I showed this at Open Studios some years ago, one of the visitors said to me, "Boy, you have a lot of chutzpah putting yourself instead of St. Francis." Well, I meant it as an homage to Bellini, and it was my way of communicating my love of his painting. This painting also includes our dog Lightning, and there was a skull and small tablets in the original painting, and I added in Hebrew, "Thou shalt not kill." The painting is both a beautiful, the original evocation of the beauty of every natural creature and form and plant. And as you see, I've added some things to it because this rock reminded me of a rock in Central Park. And I've added some buildings in the back from Fifth Avenue. I like this painting so much, the original Bellini, that I did 3 versions, which are in different collections now. Just a few more images. This is a continuation of my paintings of my mother because it's her street, East 52nd Street. And you can see I've done some trompe-l'oeil, including the inside and outside of a cafe. If you can see something, then it really exists. And I did see this looking out of the cafe with the plants hanging in outside in front of the building across the street. One more event that I was very moved by and disturbed by, as I'm sure many of you are, was the British Petroleum accident in the Gulf. My first images were of the burning oil rig, and this was in a show called Petroleum Paradox. The situation with oil is somewhat different now, but at that point, British Petroleum knew that they had had accidents, and the accident was really caused by their greed. That's a drawing of my late husband. He liked it, but he said that I should have drawn him wearing something more formal rather than a bathrobe. But I felt it was very natural. So it's one of several that I did of him. And the last two are about nature and are inspired by the Charles River in the fall, where the colors and the reflections are often quite beautiful. So I think that's it for the images, and I thank you for listening, and I'm open to complaints or comments or any kind of questions that you might have. Yes, Steve.
Over the course of your career, did you move from realism towards abstraction, or did you move back and forth?
I think it's more back and forth. I've never been a totally abstract painter, but recently some of my landscapes have become a little bit more abstract.
So what is your thought process as you approach the subject matter as to what, how you approach it, whether it should be more abstract, much more abstract, or much more realistic?
Well, when I'm dealing with, let me turn this thing off. Say something like Times Square. What I do is I take photos and I make sketches, and then I put them up on a board, and I try to think of what. Oh, thanks. How I want to approach it. And I don't really have a particular formula. As you can see, that I go all over the place in terms of things that inspire me. I don't know if I've answered your question, though.
I'm trying to get into the head of an artist in the sense of, this really is emotional, I'm going to be abstract about it, as opposed to I'm going to try to do this much more realistically.
Right,
What drives that thinking?
right. Well, in a sense, when you're emotionally stirred up by something, it often leads to, at least for me, to a long series. Like with the Gulf oil spill, I must have done 8 or 10. It started with the burning rig and the tall one, and then I began to research in the internet and started to do things that were about the cleanup. And as I worked, I began thinking of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, because it was one of my husband's favorite poems, and thinking that our dependence on oil was like an albatross around our neck. And I started putting an albatross in some of the images. So, and sometimes these are very disturbing to work on. Right now I feel there are so many disturbing things going on. I can't even deal with it. I'm trying just to do things that lift my spirits and lift other people's spirits through, color and line. Some years ago I said I was never going to do any more of this historical stuff because it was too disturbing. But it's hard to predict. Yes. Yes, Michael.
Thank you so much for a truly wonderful talk. It's very moving. I want to
Thank you.
follow your remarks about
I'm going to come closer because my hearing is terrible. You don't have to get up.
Come on, come on.
It's okay. I can stand up.
You talked about the fact that you, from time to time, worked within semi-abstract art. There were abstract elements in your art.
Yes, right.
It never became completely abstract. But I'm wondering now, when you look at the paintings of others,
Yes.
say Mondrian, do you feel there is a place where Mondrian is no longer acceptable because he's become totally abstract?
Oh no, Mondrian is not only acceptable, he was a big inspiration for me. I did a series inspired by his last painting, Broadway Boogie Woogie, and I did it, they were called Times Square Boogie Woogie. And I actually cut up pieces from his image and collaged them on several of my own paintings. And Mondrian had a wonderful trajectory going from realism to abstraction. I mean, personally, some of his very simple abstract images don't really move me that much,
The early trees of your favorite.
but things he did with trees are very beautiful. You know, I have done a few quite abstract paintings, and for some reason they don't always get out into the world. You know, people respond more to something they can hold on to, you know, something they can connect to. Is that
Yeah.
any help? Yes, yes, yes.
Well, I see sometimes you've got to abstraction because you've started doing a very detailed thing where your feelings are coming out and you've got everything in there.
Yes,
And then by a process of you getting from like looking at the depth of marker creating things. And
yes,
then you went from absorbing all that to becoming more and more symbolic. And for you that was seemed to be a process that you went through. But somebody looking at the end result and not realizing the beginning
yes,
might not appreciate the journey.
right.
So, and I think that's how sometimes we all misinterpret abstract art is that we're not part of the process.
Yes, that's a good point.
And I think that that's how sometimes we just overlook a lot of it.
So we don't understand it.
We could see the process that you've gone through. It's like when we look at the news about the massacre, we can't get enough of it. We want all of it.
Yes,
Until the process where we can't stand another bit, and it becomes a symbol. Some one thing will be symbolic of that.
of a whole
But
experience.
unless we went through that whole process, that symbol wouldn't be significant for us.
Sure.
And I think anything like that, but looking at that and seeing your process
Yes,
is much more interesting than seeing the end result and not knowing how you got there.
right. No, I think that's a good point.
So I like the fact that you do a series and you show us you show us the
Yes,
parts of that process.
yes. Well, in my book, you really see more of the series. Like on the 9/11, I have 4 images, but I was trying in the talk to sort of include something from all of these different experiences. But I think there are no rules. You do whatever you feel helps you get up in the morning. Yes.
So appreciate your sharing and the variety and the work is just so moving and beautiful. Thank you so much.
Well,
Now, what you were saying before made me wonder, do you use music at all
do I use music? You mean?
while you're working or as
No,
inspiration?
I used to. I don't now because it bothers my neighbors. the walls are very thin,
So where are you
and my hearing isn't so good. So, you know, if I put it up a little, my neighbor next door comes and knocks on the door and says, "I can't stand
So
it."
where are you working? Where's your studio?
My studio is in the center of Waltham. I brought some flyers about open studios. It's always the first weekend of November. I think this year, 4th and 5th, 5th and 6th. It's an old mill building from the 1800s that used to be part of the Francis Cabot Lowell Mills. When I first saw the building in 1980, my floor was just pigeons and glass. Everything was broken, and I went. Two other artists who are no longer alive, and I went to the landlord, and he said, "You want studios? Tell me how much space I have, and get someone to make a drawing of the space." And that's what we did. And a group of 6 actually raised the money to build the walls. We don't own it, fortunately. At one time, we tried to buy it, which would have been a nightmare. I'm glad it didn't work out. But there are a lot of artists, and it's really fun for the viewers. It's a lot of work for the artists, but it's a sense of community where people all show work, and kids can come in and ask questions. It's a good place.
So it's a neighboring artist who does not want the music.
I didn't hear you.
So it's a neighboring artist who prefers that you not play the music to her.
Yeah, it bothers her. It's okay. I don't. I can listen to music in my head. But I have brought a couple of books, if any of you are interested, and also cards that explain, a few of them lying around, how you can order a book. They were printed by Blurb, which specializes in art books. And they have something called print on demand, which is very nice. So the artist doesn't have to order 300 books. You can just order as you want. And it also is, it's available as an ebook. I think $12.95. You have to have one of these readers in order to. Yes. Yeah, I think real books are better. Yes.
I just want to put in a word for the book, because I read every word of it, and for the first time in my life, I felt that I could understand how an artist thinks and feels, and how it goes from the thinking and feeling and experience to being what we see. And nothing else that I've ever read has done that as effectively as Suzanne's book.
Yes. Thank you. Well, I feel in a way it's my most important recent creative work is this book. Actually. Well, I've taught in the past. I'm trying to get moving in some new directions. It's been a little difficult for some personal reasons, and also haven't been too healthy for a few weeks. But maybe next week I'll be able to start working again.
I think we all felt tonight it was such a unique experience, seeing the artistic development and seeing it in your words. I mean,
Yes.
that made all the difference to so many people here.
Yes.
But are you unique in doing this? I mean, are artists commonly having their thoughts down so that they can
Well,
paper?
you'd be surprised at how hard it is to find.
Yep.
Thank you. I read at least a dozen memoirs and journals by artists, everybody. Practically none of them had pictures in color. I couldn't believe it, because if you want to know what an artist's work is like, you should be able to see some of it. A Canadian artist only had pictures of herself painting or teaching, and they were all in black and white. Um, then I read how-to books, how to write a memoir, like Mary Carr. Well, these are all about how to use your dysfunctional family as a basis for something that's going to titillate people. I mean, even the recent book, The Art of Rivalry. Have any of you read it or seen it? Sebastian Smay is a wonderful critic, but the book, The Art of Rivalry, that he constantly advertises on his website and sending pictures about, my book group read it. I thought it was terrible. It was about groups of 2 artists at a time, and the entire book had only 2 pictures of each artist, and consisted mostly of stories of who slept with whom and who had fights with whom. And if you didn't know anything about these artists, you really wouldn't learn anything. So I haven't been that impressed with the books that I've read. And, I'm not out there proselytizing my book. This is my 3rd talk. I just got a request to give a talk on December 3rd at something called Limud, which I guess is a yearly event having to do with creative work by people who were Jewish in the area. And I don't know too much about it, but since a friend of mine asked me, I said I would consider it. I did try through traditional means, through a friend in New York who, with her recently deceased 103-year-old mother, ran a publishing company. And she tried hard to get some of the regular publishers interested in this, and they were full of praise, but they said, sorry, we can't make any money from it. So publishing is a whole other business that I can't begin to understand, but I'm very impressed by the work that Blurb did. The color in this book is better than the color in lots of art books that I have. So maybe it's time for cookies.